Hey, I wanted to welcome everybody. Thanks for joining today. We've got some people filtering in as we're talking, but I'm going to go ahead and get started, just being conscientious of everyone's time. For those of you guys who don't know me, I am Jayson Blair. I'm the managing partner of Goose Creek Consulting. We are a coaching firm based in Northern Virginia. We do organizational development, coaching, and facilitation work. And, a core part of that practice for us is utilizing assessment. So I'm really excited today to talk a little bit about this. Just so you have some of my background, I am an executive coach by background. I have been doing this, you can see from, oh, the gray hair is missing today because I shaved. I've been doing it too long, but I think since about 2007. I really love coaching. I really love working with coaches, and I'm excited to talk to you guys about this today. Um, a lot of my work has been in applied personality work and applied psychology. So you guys understand probably that that requires some measure of depth and understanding people, their motivations, and their values. And, I will walk through today, if you indulge me, a little bit of theory, but then some real practical tips for assessment practice. So, it's going to be broken up into these six parts, this opening. I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of the practitioner framework, a little bit about how to read the assessment. And within that practitioner framework part, I'll talk about some things that I think are really core fundamentally to think about in doing any kind of assessment debrief. Then I'll go through some debrief tips and then also a case study that I have for you guys. As we go through, I'm going to ask you guys some questions. Feel free to use the Q&A that's up top to drop in your thoughts or questions that you have or any observations you have. Um, and with that, I will go ahead and get started. So, I wanted to start off with why I am the absolute wrong person to give a measured talk about anything, much less this. This is my Hogan profile. And before what I tell you, before I tell you what I think is sort of wrong with the way the coaching industry and the way we do debriefs, it only seems fair to show you the assessment data that sort of proves who the person is who's making the argument. In the interest of full transparency, and because my prudence is zero, it means I genuinely did not consider whether this was a good idea. So, a zero on prudence, this isn't a score. It's really a lifestyle for me. This means that I don't slow down as a person. I tend not to second guess. I don't read the sort of terms and conditions of any contracts you put in front of me. And I've never once in my life ever thought maybe I should wait and see how this develops. I made the decision to give this a talk probably about 45 seconds ago. Truthfully, before then, but it's very much my personality. The title probably came up to me. It was rewritten right before I sort of hung up the phone on a call. On my 97 on bold, my 100 on mischievous, and my 100 on colorful and 100 imaginative, not a surprise to anybody who's met me. Four derailers at or near the ceiling. Now, if you know the HDS, you know that these four are sort of the most flamboyant derailers in the instrument. Confident to the point of grandiosity, I'll admit, risk-taking to the point of impulsive train wrecks, and dramatic to the point of being really distracting. So I'm going to do my best not to be distracting and being organized today. And I'm also a little idiosyncratic to the point of this presentation. So the good news is I have a 31 on excitable, so I won't cry, probably. On my 100 in inquisitive and my 100 in science and 100 in aesthetics, inquisitive at 100, science at 100, aesthetics at 100, this means I'm constitutionally required to sort of understand how everything works. I need it to be theoretically grounded and I need the slides to really look good. So, This isn't really sort of an ambition for me. It's more of a compulsion. And the presentation that you're about to see isn't really a career choice. It's more of a personality outcome for me. And on my 100 on altruistic and my 6 on affiliation, I care deeply about helping people. I don't particularly need to be around them to be able to do it. So webinars are great for me. Um, this is, I've been told, somewhat an unusual combination. My clients find it helpful. My family finds it totally perplexing. And on the 76 on reserved, that one actually surprises people. Reserved at 76, this is one that always confuses people when they meet me because I present as a very highly social and energetic person. But there is a private interior here for me that the performance doesn't really reveal. I notice everything. I share selectively. I have strong opinions about most of what I observe. Those opinions, as you may have already gathered, often become a presentation. So here's the profile. Here's what my profile actually shows. A person who's stable enough not to be destabilized by complexity, driven enough to pursue an idea past the point of comfort, curious enough to cross disciplinary lines, and completely unbothered by what's convention or what's been done before. My tradition score is at 1, securities at 0, affiliation at 6. This isn't a profile of somebody who really knows how to stay in their lane. The reason I went deep into some of the ideas you'll see here, like socioanalytic theory, is not that I think I worked harder than other coaches. It's that my profile made that kind of depth and that dive inevitable. That prudence at 0 means I could not skim the surface. Inquisitive at 100 means I could not stop at the instruments themselves. And science at 100 and aesthetics at 100 really mean I need it to both be true and coherent. So this profile predicted the practitioner you have in front of you. What I want to dive into first, before I really go, is this concept of sort of like two coaches. You know, on one side, you have the assessment technician who really prepares for a session as an informed source. I sort of think of the master practitioner as somebody who knowingly explores data and prepares to learn from the client. For somebody who's a master practitioner, you come into it with a hypothesis for sure, but only until you hit the field and the client contributes context can you truly begin to develop a deeper understanding. So, just consider this idea sort of. You've got two coaches who are both ICF certified, both using something like the Hogan assessments, both sitting across from the same client, a high performing senior leader who's received sort of the same 360 feedback 3 times and has changed absolutely nothing. Coach A delivers the report, explains the scales, identifies the developmental themes, creates the smart action plan. The session is clean, professional, and it may be entirely useless. Coach B notices something different. The leader's HPI, interpersonal sensitivity score is low, but in the room, they're acutely attuned to every shift in the coach's demeanor. The HDS bold score, let's say, is elevated, but they speak about their team with what sounds like genuine concern. Something doesn't really fit here. And Coach B sits in that gap. That gap is where a lot of the real work begins. So, what does Coach B know that Coach A doesn't? That's sort of like the framework that I'm thinking about today. And as we go through, I'd love to hear your thoughts on what sort of makes the difference between that sort of Coach A and that Coach B. So, just a real quick note, this is a scene from, John Nash from A Beautiful Mind, presenting a mathematical insight that his colleagues can't quite follow, not because they're less intelligent, but because they're not standing where he's standing. They haven't spent 20 years at the intersection of game theory, geometry, something that from the outside looks like obsession. The insight really requires a vantage point. You can't have one without the other. And what I'm not doing right now is comparing myself to John Nash. But what I'm saying is that if you really want to understand people, you've got to be able to dive into the underlying frameworks that really contribute to understanding, you know, understanding what is really there. So indulge me with a little bit of a discussion up front about some of those underlying theories and concepts. So, you know, the master practitioner to that point is really born at intersections. You know, a master practitioner, I think, is really, somewhere at the intersection. I don't think you need any of these things real depth in them in the sense of having an academic understanding or getting a degree, but really being curious about them. I think at my intersections personally, were clinical psychology, behavioral psychology, and a more surprising one, actually journalism and all that natural curiosity. But yours might be something like behavioral economics, or you may come from the consulting field, or a lot of people come from law. It's not sort of the particular intersection that you come from, but it's having one or more ways to sort of look at things. And I'll walk you through sort of how I find or what I find powerful and practical in this kind of work related to coaching and assessment feedback. So I came to the work from a clinical foundation, really deep exposure to psychodynamic theory and the therapeutic relationship and defense mechanisms and the way that sort of relational experience structures sort of adult functioning. And when I use the example of my Hogan, when Hogan talks about identity and reputation as analytically distinct, I sort of hear, object relations. If you come from a public relations background, you may hear something very different. But it's still these same concepts and ideas that we see in life. You know, for me personally, the clinical frame doesn't translate directly into coaching, but it's sort of a peer, or it sort of helped prepare me to hear, some of the things that I do. One more quick thing, one of the things that you all know, I think, is that under one powerful but limited tool or framework, a person making an argument about master practitioners, especially one that's got a bold at 97 and a prudence at 0 and 4 derailers at the ceiling, you can decide for yourself whether this is more or less credible. But what I want to tell you is this. The profile that makes me a sort of questionable candidate for giving any kind of measured talk is exactly the same profile that sort of made deep practice of really a deep interest to me and sort of unavoidable that I would head in this direction. I couldn't have done it any other way, which is, as it happens, precisely the argument that I'm about to make. I really do believe, like I was saying before, a master practitioner isn't made by any particular curriculum. They're built on the collision of a particular profile with a particular body of ideas and the person that we're debriefing at the moment. So our job really, for the sake of argument in this talk, is to figure out how to make that collision a little bit less accidental. And so I'm going to go ahead and start with the practitioner framework. And so first, one of the things, in order to effectively analyze assessments and do debriefs, we need to throw out a lot of what's been taught to us by other practitioners. And why do I say that? Because we don't have a profession that's built on a really strong foundation. And this isn't an exhaustive list of reasons, but there are a few examples of sort of like that are caught in history that I'll go over with that sort of undermine, I think, our general approach. I'll do a brief accessible history and I won't dwell on that so much, but I wanted to at first just talk a little bit about assessment-based coaching in general. And, in assessment-based coaching, it's really based on the idea that coaching feedback provides an opportunity for the client to identify what drives them and how they show up to others. This is the what, right? And this really broadens their aperture. The what naturally leads to the so what, which focuses on exploring, Now that we have some development ideas, which are sort of the areas of focus that we'll sort of narrow in on, the so what leads to the now what. How am I going to implement these changes? The process sort of shows up in two places in debriefing. Within sort of like a one-off feedback session, and then in an extended coaching engagement, you sort of repeat it. And this makes feedback and coaching really practical. So, with these principles and this approach, you know, the question is, how do we as coaches maximize the opportunity? The first answer from my perspective is that we bring all the tools we have to the table and we use them when appropriate. Any assessment feedback is really a combination of the results, the client, and the debriefer. We tend to, in coaching, focus more on protocol than what we bring to the table through our own personalities, values, and experiences. And a concept from therapy, given my background, came to mind here. This is from Irving Yalom, who is sort of one of the masters in the actual application of therapy. This quote from him, paraphrase, is a good therapist should learn all the tools and apply them when necessary. No one should strive to be a specialist. The specialist is a person who's found one hammer and now only sees nails. This concept applies to therapy, but it also applies to coaching and assessment feedback. The master practitioner in assessment-based coaching is defined by not sort of like the depth of knowledge in a single framework, but by the breadth of lenses available and the knowledge to know which one to pick up in any particular moment. And so, foundationally, a lot of coaching comes out of two core things. One is industrial organizational psychology, and then general coaching certification. I've talked a little bit about general coaching certification in the sense that we really do focus on techniques, we focus on rapport, with industrial organizational psychology, it was really built to answer practical challenges that existed during the manufacturing era and early on. But it looks at it through a very, very, very narrow lens. Another element that coaching is really built on is social psychology, and a lot of assessment feedback is also built on social psychology. And what we found out over the years is that a lot of what we believed about social psychology, priming effects, ego depletion, so many other things ultimately failed to hold up. And this led to this event that we talk about in social psychology called the replication crisis, where people attempted to replicate a lot of the studies that had been done before and ultimately found out that they couldn't be replicated. Ego depletion is the one where the idea that willpower is this finite resource that depletes like a muscle. Large scale replications found no similar effect. You may have heard of this one, power posing. 2 minutes of expansive posture was supposed to raise, cortisol, testosterone, and risk tolerance. Could not be repeated either. The marshmallow test. It's this idea of delayed gratification. Take a bunch of 4-year-olds, and the ones that didn't pick up the marshmallows when they were put in front of them scored higher on the SAT. The original founding sort of confounded willpower and privilege. Last week, I was in a certification course, and this was one of the examples that they gave to talk about the assessment tool itself. I wanted to jump. Um, Priming effects are another one, if you've heard of that theory. The Stanford prison experiment, that's another one that could not be replicated. Positivity ratio, which is this idea that, the ratio of positive to negative emotions was sort of the tipping point between flourishing and languishing. That's another one that ultimately couldn't be proved. And so it's an important thing to keep in mind that a lot of the fields with sort of the weakest scientific rigor often have the most public influence. And, to build a foundation on that, ultimately, makes a lot of what I think is at our foundation when we think about assessments, debrief, and coaching to be a lot shakier than we imagined. So I sort of start with some universal things. First one is that development and insight into people basically comes down to the idea that humans are really squishy, right? We don't have the sharpest teeth, we don't have large claws, we can't fly, we're not the strongest animal, we cannot swim, we are not the fastest animal. Humans really are squishy. And this is a world that's a dangerous place, and it's a place you're likely to be eaten in. And this is a fundamental reason that we sort of pursue what we pursue and why we ultimately form teams. I know a lot of people like to say it's the opposable thumb that really makes humans different, but it's really our ability to form groups and teams and clans. So, two of the most important things because of that, it's to understand what fulfills us ultimately, what we value, what drives us, but also to understand how other people perceive us. Because if everything we do in life, whether it's getting ahead or getting along or finding meaning, is done through other people, looking at the gap between what fulfills us and how we're perceived is a great way to think about development. This is a quote from Robert Hogan. Humans are the most dangerous animals on the planet. Short of solar flares, people are the biggest threat to other people. If you're going to work with people, wouldn't it be important to know something about that? So if we need to operate in teams and survive, our leaders are the ones, if you can believe this, according to a lot of research, that are the most likely to kill us. Um, if you look over the previous century, many more people were actually killed by their own leaders than both of the world wars. So leadership really does matter, and understanding people really matters. So I always start with the motivational foundation for people. And I think this is really something important to think about anytime you're assessing someone. Understanding the core motivations of humans is just key to analyzing assessments and giving debriefs. This is sort of imperative in the sense that it's not, these things that are on here are not a luxury, but they're really linked to our sense of survival as humans. We need to get along to be able to survive and to cooperate. We need to get ahead in order to feel like we're in a safer position and that we're adding value. And we need to find meaning in a world where it's really hard, um, to find connection, to find belonging. And this sort of motive model, getting along, getting ahead, and finding meaning holds across cultures, across assessment methods, across contexts. This is sort of the most robust and practically important finding in applied personality work. So, getting along, it's that need for acceptance, belonging, harmonizing relationships. It's really rooted and involved in this sort of like requirement to live in social groups, getting ahead, the need for status, influence, recognition. That's all rooted and involved in sort of hierarchy structures and group life, and finding meaning, the need for purpose, coherence, and a sense that a person's life matters. It's expressed through values, worldview, identity. And sort of as a practitioner, you want to be able to sort of locate any of those presenting coaching issues within this motivational architecture and sort of know how the most intractable problems people face almost always are conflicts between these universal motives, not deficits in their capabilities. So you can look at a client's assessment results, you can talk to a client, really think about these sort of three things when you're analyzing and you're actually debriefing them. Second layer is reputation and strategic self-awareness. You see this in a personality assessment like the Hogan. You also see it in 360s. Any assessment feedback is about developing self-awareness. What makes that self-awareness strategic is that it's actionable. So my self-awareness in terms of how I see Jason is less valuable than the way that the rest of you all see me. Because if my underlying premise is right, that, you know, everything we accomplish in life is through other people, knowing what you think of me is really important to how I can contribute to the broader group. But and so what really makes it actionable is having that outside view, you know, because that gap that I'm talking about between the way I see myself and the way that you see me is where we can have the most impactful development. The next piece, I think, always thinking about the bright side, the dark side, and the inside of a person. The bright side is really how our traits are expressed when we're self-monitoring. That's the everyday us. The dark side explores sort of those moments under stress or not paying attention where we derail. And any of you guys who have looked into a 360 report, you see like it's almost like two different people are showing up in the comments. It's often because of that. And the inside, it's really values, motivations, and psychological environment. And so I encourage you guys when you're doing any kind of assessment to really look for those bright side, dark side, and inside characteristics and traits. And also to think about how can we integrate these things. And what does the bright side tell us about a person? What does the dark side tell us? And what are their motivations? And I think one way to think about it is not to work through it sequentially, but how do we really integrate them, hold them, even when they feel like conflicts? How do we hold them together sort of simultaneously? The fourth thing I think really is important, not to pull out any particular field, is to understand human attachment. I think having a little literacy in the idea of attachment is super important. Very important to our infant ancestors on the savannah was really understanding or being able to attach to things is what kept us safe. And I think a coach who understands a little bit about attachment, I'm not going to go too deep in it. We had a webinar on this topic. I think it was about 2 weeks ago. This can be a powerful way to understand things like why someone may resist change, why somebody may have a blind spot to other people's discomfort with change. And a lot of it has to do with we attach to these different objects to feel safe, and change creates a moment where we fear we're going to lose one object and we're trying to desperately search for another. Um, Second thing, or excuse me, fifth thing to think about is the room that a person creates. We want to think as we're working with them, both as coaches and in debriefing, what kind of room is this person creating around them? It's under that idea that you get what you pull for. Dominance might pull submission or counter dominance, depending on the other person you're dealing with and their style. Warmth may pull warmth, hostility may pull for hostility or withdrawal by other people. Indifference may pull in another direction. And the implication for coaching and debriefing here is that, leaders maybe are not just sort of expressing when, let's say, they're derailing a problematic trait or a positive trait when things are going well. They're generating this interpersonal field around them that also produces confirming evidence and also creates challenges. So it's the idea that the arrogant leader may create sycophants. It's not necessarily that they are around them. And all these forces are both impacting the leader that you're debriefing and the people who are around them. Next thing, this idea of dominance and prestige. It's a very common sort of like derailment story for a lot of people. People who build sort of like a prestige-based status early in their career, you know, under the pressure and visibility of senior leadership, and they shift to sort of dominance-based tactics without realizing it. These two things and sort of understanding where your client is sort of landing and what they're pursuing, it can be a really important and helpful thing in thinking about debriefing. Final thing I want to throw out there is context as an activator. Anytime you're working on an assessment, analyzing, or doing a debrief, you want to think about the context that someone's operating in. Here we're looking at it from the perspective of an organization, but this could be applied to a family as well. At the organizational context and that activator, um, we're really looking at how culture plays in a role, cultural fit. We're looking at what is the strategy of the organization. On the individual level, we want to explore the personal context of a person. What is their purpose in life, more broadly than work? And how is that purpose fulfilled at work? Without understanding that context, I can look at a person's assessment results and I could, for those of you who know me, you'll love this example. It's very true. If you saw my assessment results, you would certainly understand why I'm a coach. You would get why I'm a consultant. If I were your air traffic controller, you would stop flying. So until you have that context about what role I'm in, you can't look at my Hogan or even look at many of my assessment results and really get a good idea of whether something should be a development area or not. And another piece to that is understanding the person's role demands. What accountabilities do they have? What unique challenges are they facing? Because then that lets you think about really the behaviors, the experiences, the traits, and the drivers that are going to be relevant to the job. So the whole idea is, context doesn't excuse behavior. The purpose of it is to get precise and have precision. And so we don't want to just know who the person is, but who is this person in this role, under these conditions, in this environment. And so I'm going to jump now to sort of this idea of reading the assessment. I'm going to hop through this really quickly, but one of the things I want you guys to think about is a moment where you have had an assessment in your hands and you have been baffled because it doesn't fit the person in front of you. And I'll send you all of these slides afterwards, but it's just something to keep in the back of your mind, those contradictions, because often when you feel those moments of contradiction, that's the moment to ask the question because there's probably something there. Another thing, and I won't dive into this, coaching is obviously not therapy. No one needs to be a therapist to be a coach, but I think one of the things to keep in mind is a lot of the personality frameworks we deal with, a lot of the behavioral competencies that we deal with are actually rooted in clinical psychology. So having a little understanding of that space can be super helpful. And I think another thing to think about is that no person is one scale or competency. Taking this as an example, a person who's low in interpersonal sensitivity or agreeableness is often described as really direct, candid, straightforward, but potentially abrasive or argumentative. But a person, if that same person is also high and altruistic, they're likely to be focused on helping people, coaching, being of service. You know, they care about the have-nots, the welfare of others. Um, but when you combine these things together, you get a very different profile than your just low interpersonal sensitivity person. You get this concept and you get this idea of tough love. And my point here is simply to say that you cannot look just at one scale without considering um, the others. This is another example. A person, I'm sure most of you guys have seen a 360 report where, bosses see the person as really agreeable, supportive, loyal. Direct reports see them as a bloody nightmare. These combinations, I think, can give you sort of like a decent understanding. In this example, person who's low in adjustment, often described as really vigilant, self-aware, as somebody who operates with a high sense of urgency, but may sort of be self-doubting or pessimistic or stress-prone. A person who's high and excitable, they're often described as really intense and energetic, but potentially moody, volatile, inconsistent, or unpredictable. This combination is sort of a classic short fuse, big bomb. You know, if you combine that with somebody who's also high and skeptical, you can also get a person who feels that other people may eventually ultimately fail and let them down. But when you start looking at other scales, you see other stories. So when I combine this with high cautious, high dutiful, and high altruistic, that might be a big bomb, but that bomb is likely to go off in my client's head. And almost never, depending on other factors, is going to land on their boss's head. And that can create a huge blind spot around this person and the people who are trying to support them. So, the one thing I want to really encourage everybody to do is really think about um, the complexity of the clients and not really working through one particular scale, but who is this person when I bring it all together? And, I'm using Hogan because it's a simple example, but you can see the same thing play out in 360 reports as well. So, want to go ahead and just walk through some of those sort of like key things in setting up a really good debrief. Obviously, one of the first steps is building rapport. That's kind of fundamental. Helps establish trust with the client, along with confidentiality. It really helps bring the client to ease. You know, laughing at your own opportunities, sort of like I did at the beginning of this, probably doesn't hurt either. You also want to establish credibility. It's not about tooting your horn, but you want the person to know that they're with a person who's experienced, where it's going to be safe, where they're going to get insights. It really helps them when they know they're in the hands of a professional. And here are some fundamental debriefing techniques. Regardless of whether it's from benchmarks or Korn Ferry or Hogan, the key elements are really the same. Effective feedback is built on context. It's really the king. You know, Attributes really come from the assessment results and then action. The action that's really going to come from it brings it all together. And so context is not really throat clearing before the real debrief. It's where the assessment feedback provider gathers the information that's really needed to know what the scores actually mean. You know, in the moment, I'm often thinking about my own sort of analysis and contextualizing it, um, even rewriting it in my head to make it deeper and more nuanced. Thinking about the contradictions that I'm seeing or the contextual challenges. I often find myself as we were discussing, sort of as me and the client are discussing attributes or results, calling back to the context that the participant has given me. Um, so what is context? There are lots of different pieces of context. You got organizational context, life demands, job role demands, the person's purpose, their aspirations. No assessment results are worth a hill of beans without context. Before I have assessment results, total consultant, terrible air traffic controller. You don't want me to be the safety inspector, making sure there's not E. coli in your food. Um, you know, let the client know that their context matters. Many clients have read the assessment reports before, and let them know that that context is really, really important. And you can do this by asking questions that are as simple as like, what are the key roles of your job? How did you get to where you are in life right now? What are some of your aspirations? Asking about the strategy, how they feel like they fit into the culture. How do they find fulfillment in their work? You know, all of these things can help you really get a good idea of their context and then apply the analysis you've done. Obviously, you know, there's a lot that's above the line and below the line. We talk a lot about competencies, which are behaviors or clusters of behaviors and experiences. They're very obvious to people. Traits, drivers, and derailers, harder to see, and sort of the foundation for development. And it's in exploring the attributes, regardless of the assessment that you're looking at. I love the Korn Ferry model of the 4 dimensions of leadership to really be able to think about the behaviors that are required for success in their job, the life experiences that have prepared the person, and then the personality traits, the drives, sort of the inclinations they have that will either lead them to be successful or derail, and then also the things that really motivate them. And so as you enter a debrief, think about what's visible and what's not. Does this person have a lot of internal churn, but appear calm on the outside? I'm sure you've all run into people who fit in that mold. Um, you know, ask them how it shows up. If they're like the client I was showing you before with the low interpersonal sensitivity, high altruistic, how does it show up? How do they care? Do people know? I think it's really can lead to some meaningful, impactful development ideas. So I'm going to walk you guys through a little bit of a case study. Meet Molly. She's in her first people leader job and is also taking the Hogan assessments and the Korn Ferry emotional social competency inventory. It's a 360, and you're the coach who's about to debrief her. I want you guys to take a look for a second and tell me what you see in her profile. I'll give it a second for anybody to drop anything into the chat or the Q&A. I see Craig brought up his all blues in the 90s. I am happy to give you an analysis on that as well. Um, Anybody have anything that you see in Molly's profile that stands out to you? Check. Nobody does. So I'll go ahead and give you some of the things that I see. I see high ambition in her profile, and I see low adjustment. Molly's probably really driven to compete, achieve, and win, while often or even constantly worrying about failure and being criticized. I see high sociability, high interpersonal sensitivity, lower reserved on her HDS, lower leisurely on her HDS, higher affiliation on her motives, values, preferences inventory, and high altruistic. This is a people person. She cares about things like belong to and is engaged and engaging, although she might struggle because of excessive concern about the feelings of others. May struggle with some social boundaries and jumping into always helping overwhelmed sort of colleagues or bosses. You might see some of these things here. You often see in clients Molly might be a little skeptical. She's a little higher in skeptical of the coaching process. And you want to think about, those kinds of things in how you do your debrief. Maybe a little bit more time on report, a little bit more time with Molly explaining the assessment tool. Um, I also see the high aesthetics in her profile too. She might get a little bit more creative and big picture. Also, the imaginative is higher than her inquisitive. So she might get a little bit more creative when she's under stress. You also, with a higher dutiful, she may have sort of strong signs of being really supportive and loyal, but maybe at times a little eager to please. You want to think about all those factors, and then when you get that context, really think about which ones are most relevant for Molly and her job. So we've got her ESCI results from the Korn Ferry Emotional Social Competence Inventory. Here are some of the things that I notice in her profile. Molly rates herself higher than her raters in 8 of the 12 competencies. Molly rates herself lower than the norm group in 7 of the 12 competencies. Um, One of the things I also notice, her raters rate her at or higher than the norm groups. That teamwork, and several of the competencies really felt to her, in Molly's case, probably in a previous role, may need to be adjusted to her current context. So let me give you the backstory on Molly. She thrived in a role as an individual contributor at her company because she sort of built trust quickly. She supported teammates. She sort of stayed positive under pressure, and was the person that other people sought out when they needed sort of like calm or an empathetic hand or a sounding board. Molly was seen as somebody who sort of naturally coached colleagues and even interns, and she was a natural fit for this new role. But she really struggled in the new role to adjust quickly when priorities shifted and seemed to have a tendency of sort of stepping in to fix problems because she thought it would be helpful. And so, really, a difficult time keeping boundaries with members of her team who are now reporting to her instead of being her colleagues. So, Molly got these results on the ESCI 360 and didn't recognize herself in the 360 results. So take a look at the scores for Molly for a moment and ask yourself what you notice. Feel free again to drop any comments either into the chat or the Q&A. But what else do you notice in there? I like that point about unsure of own value. And Marcia, I agree, the low prudence and the high cautious, it can be a little bit confusing how those two things go together, but I'm happy to take a swing at that. Let me jump back to her Hogan, Marcia, to tackle your this piece. So, every day, Molly has low prudence, so she's flexible, tolerant of ambiguity, but possibly a little disorganized. But the high cautious that you're pointing out, being careful and thorough, but sort of like risk avoidant, is that stress response. So we know with Molly, while she may be really tolerant of ambiguity and doesn't necessarily sort of plan very well, she is also very fearful. So we know the gap between those two spaces, especially with the low adjustment and fear associated with that. She's probably quite fearful of getting herself in trouble because of that flexibleness or because of not being organized. I hope that answered your question, Marcia. And yes, with the high dutiful and the low prudence, that can be a lot of people pleasing, Vicky. I would agree with that. And, you know, I think that's what you're getting at. But yeah, I think that some of the people pleasing can be connected. The high dutiful and the high cautious can actually have this sort of synergy together. Although at the same time, a bit of a conflict too, because when you're really careful and thorough, you often want to slow processes down out of uncertainty or fear of failure, particularly when they're new processes. But with high dutiful and you wanting to please, you may really, really be eager um, to speed things up to please your bosses. And that can create a bit of a conflict for people. Um, Jennifer, to your point about her low learning approach, I think really just a hands-on learner, high aesthetics, big picture view, science is a little bit more elevated. I think the way that you would interpret at least that low learning approach, that she learns by doing, getting her hands on it. So, and most of those things sort of did bear out the questions you guys were bringing up. Actually, many of them did bear out in the assessment results. That's all really sort of like interesting stuff. And so I'll let you know kind of some of the things that, right? And some of the challenges she was having related to people leadership, and we really dug into it. Considering the context that I mentioned, right, when it came to teamwork and coaching and mentoring, she had some blind spots in the new role. Part of the challenge was Molly hadn't really adjusted those skills. Some of these competencies that we're seeing here, which is important for any leader, to the context she was now in. They really worked very well for her when she was able to sort of jump in and help and coach and mentor and connect with people. But once she moved into this new context where she needed to lead them, those same things were being perceived as micromanaging, not trusting, controlling. And so this is a real way that when you combine all of this data and you look at it holistically, like you guys are in the chat, good job. Um, you can get a clearer picture and a stronger hypothesis going on. So some things that I like to think about going into any debrief is that motivational architecture I talked about. What environment is this person trying to build? Context. What do I know about the context before I go in, which sometimes is not much. And then what conflicts exist and what synergies exist within the assessment results. Um, I wanted to talk a little bit about action, that idea of bringing that what that you're getting. This is who the person is, to the so what, which is what do I do about this? We all have a trillion things that we could work on, or at least a billion things we could work on. How do we narrow that focus so we can get action? Often the answers are in that context and that purpose for the person and what drives them. I really think that instead of doing development plans, we look at our strengths and opportunities. We should really start with what is our purpose and how is that purpose fulfilled in whatever context we're talking about, work or whatever aspect of life, and then pick your development areas and pick the strengths that you want to reinforce based on that context. So being able to ask your clients before they sort of dive into the debrief, one or two things that they may to think about, one or two things that they may want to focus on when you get to the end and bring it all together, because any assessment result can be very overwhelming for the client. Bringing it back together to find those two or three things is what wraps it together, makes it actionable, and makes it much more understandable. So carving out that time at the end of the debrief to really say, hey, so what do you want to focus on? And ideally, your client will come up with something, but you want to have a couple things in the back of your mind that they can continue doing, stop doing, and start doing related to the most important competencies in their context. You know, so you guys have probably all heard of this methodology, the keep doing, start doing, stop doing methodology, where you're able to give development recommendations on what the person should continue doing, what they should start doing, what they should stop doing. I think the mistake that is often made in delivering this will often sort of like pick out a positive thing about a person that they should keep doing, something they may start doing, something they want to stop doing. But you really want to frame the keep doing, start doing, and stop doing around the same behavior and competency. So the idea is the temptation is to just sort of pull out separate things from across the report, but I think a more powerful way is to help people really understand how the quality you're discussing shows up in a, positive way. And this is the part that they should keep doing. That's the calibration. And here's a part they should start doing and how they should stop doing. So here are some developmental suggestions for Molly. Continue using your positive social skills and the ability to connect with people productively. Consider focusing on not allowing others to sort of have unlimited access to you and not jumping in to help when, it's a moment or an opportunity for somebody else to learn, and consider focusing on projecting confidence and setting boundaries with others and saying no when necessary, sometimes even no to your own instincts. So you can see that these three recommendations are all really about the same behavior. And that's how I think it can truly be powerful for clients. And usually I'll have two or three of these in the back of my mind, two or three of these clusters of three in the back of my mind before I go into a debrief. I'll have them written on a piece of paper. And as we go through the debrief, I will edit them so they can be impactful for the client if we need to go to my recommendations. Um, this is a one-page debrief method. We will send it over to you guys. It's the building rapport, gathering context. An important part I didn't go to is explaining the tool. You know, I'm 100 on science. You might as well send me the technical manual before you send me the reports. But I think even if you are a 0 on science, it's really important for the client to understand what the tool is measuring and what it is. The debrief is really feedback to get that what and to get that so what. And if it's a one-off, also the now what. There are times where debriefing is a part of a coaching engagement that the debrief may only cover the what, and you will get to the so what and the now what in your future coaching engagements. I try to do a mini version of that in any debrief, uh, but often in a coaching engagement, I'll repeat the process. But really, having the client walk out thinking about the idea of who I can be, who do I want to be, who I can be, really brings them to a place where they can absorb the feedback and make it really, really productive. So, in closing, and I see a couple questions over there, it's not a matter of whether coaches are competent in my mind. Competence is sort of the floor. The real question is, can we be genuinely useful to complex people, which is everyone, in complex roles? Um, I don't think I think it could be a training problem, selection problem, all sorts of other problems. But really, the answer, regardless of what it may be, is building a model of practice for yourself. I really think a master practitioner isn't a person who knows the most frameworks. They're a person who can sit with a human being with all their complexity, contradiction, history, and be genuinely useful to them. That capacity is built by you, it's not certified. And then I think a masterful debrief brings it all together so the client can see what fulfills them, how they are seen, can narrow things down to really practical things that the person can act on in their context, and it guides them towards specific steps they can take. So, Dan has a question in the chat. Oh, I see Rebecca's there. Rebecca, I owe you credit. You've taught me half of what I know. Dan, asked the question, do you feel we also need to be cognizant of whether the individual is a square peg trying to fit into an organization's round hole? Would it be good to check our assumptions in this context? I was recently having a conversation about this in the context of debriefing, and someone had asked me, how do you figure out when you sort of need to coach a person outside the organization? You know, Often for me, it's when we're looking at their context, we're looking at their personality, their behaviors, their experiences, what's going to fulfill them. And often, development ideas are about them changing within their context. But when the only answer to the client is really to change the context as opposed to change themselves because those behaviors, those values are so important to them, when that is sort of like the conclusion they're coming to, that's when you sort of know that the fit, whether that's a job or it's at the organization, isn't naturally good. I hope I answered your question, Dan, and I hopefully did. Well, guys, I really appreciate the time. Thank you so much for coming. I really enjoyed talking about this. We'll probably have a couple other webinars over the summer. We're looking forward to engaging with you guys. For those of you guys who are part of our Goose Creek network, we plan to actually start some calls over the summer where we'll go over case studies related to specific assessments. It won't be like a webinar. It'll be more of a we all get on together and we talk about particular assessments. So feel free to send me suggestions about assessment tools you'd like to look at or profiles, as long as you keep that information confidential that you'd like to explore. Go out there and continue to do good work helping your clients. I'm sure, like many of you guys, I know I love being in this profession because we have such an opportunity to have positive impact on people's lives. We have such an awesome opportunity to make organizations better. And I'm really honored to be considered a coach and to be with you guys as a collective community. And we'll talk soon. Thanks, everyone.